Good to see people signing in. Please go ahead and do that. So before we get going, just a reminder that the fourth quiz due date was moved to tonight. We got a little bit behind, so I'm going to try to get through chapter 13 today to get us caught up. So I have an abbreviated version of chapter 13 that I'm going to do for you guys so we can get through that chapter in one day and then get back on schedule so that we have the allotted time available to cover mental illnesses and mental health treatment, the last couple of chapters. That's 14 and 15. I'll have those slides posted for you guys here within the next few days, definitely before our next class meeting. We still have folks logging in. So for those of you who have just logged in, please do go ahead and sign in. And as I was saying, you guys have a quiz due tonight covering chapters 12 and 13. And I think I might have a couple of essays that I overlooked to grade from essay 2. I thought I had them all graded, but I think I noticed that I had a couple left that I still need to grade. So if you're one of those people, I apologize for the oversight. I'm going to get those graded here very soon. And please do be thinking about, well, not just thinking about, but actually working. Please be working on your third essay, which I believe is due, let's see here, that is due on April 23rd, which is a week from today. So I do have the recommended topic that I've talked about that regards mental illness, pick a mental illness, write about it and its treatment. But if you have a topic that interests you that doesn't pertain to mental health, I'm totally open-minded. If you want to pick an alternative topic for your third essay, just run it by me. I think I have a few folks who have emailed me about that I'm going to be getting back to this afternoon. And I've seen all sorts of creative topics from folks over the years for the third essay, and it's kind of my favorite round of essays to grade because I see the most creative topics come through usually in that regard. All right, so here in a second, let me go ahead and get these slides pulled up. We will go ahead and jump into chapter 13 on personality.
Can I ask a question about the third essay?
Sure.
Okay, so it's APA, and I don't write like a lot of APA papers, so do you suggest like after the intro, like have a section about like symptoms? Like, is it formatted similar to that?
Yeah, so I mean, as far as the way you structure the content of the essay, you have a lot of latitude. What I would probably recommend as a general structure, start with an introductory paragraph that introduces the concept of mental illness more generally. You know, usually in an intro, you start general and then get specific, right? So you know, so then towards the end of the intro paragraph, narrow it down to the mental illness you've selected, you know, and then ends with a thesis statement about that particular mental illness. And then you might do a body paragraph that describes the symptoms of the particular mental illness that you've selected. And then you might do an additional paragraph that describes treatments, you know, treatment modalities for that mental illness, and you know, and then a concluding paragraph to tie it all together. If you want to also throw in a paragraph that maybe gives an example of a person who has that particular mental illness, that would be something that you could do. But I would say at minimum, you have your intro paragraph that introduces it. You have the first body paragraph that would describe the symptoms of that mental illness, maybe with some examples. Second body paragraph that describes treatment, and a concluding paragraph that kind of ties it all up. Yeah, if that helps.
Okay. I think for the yeah, it helped me understand it better. I think for that paragraph that you said to like throw in, I could probably use one from the like a story from the library, the PST library, as
Yeah.
my to include a second source.
Yeah, and as long as they're just not copying and pasting it, like maybe reiterate it in your own words, and provide a citation of the journal article that you're drawing it from, or the book that you're drawing it from, and that'd be just fine. Yeah, that'd be great. And Jonathan makes a great point in the comments. He mentioned the APA template. So if you haven't seen the APA template file that I've posted on Canvas, that might be helpful to you as well. Although you have
that's
to
the one I always use.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Other questions about the third essay? Anybody have any topics that you might want to run by me here while we're here? All right. So if you haven't signed in, please go ahead and do that, and we'll go ahead and jump into chapter 13 on personality. So as I mentioned, I'm doing sort of an abridged version of this lecture. I originally had 2 days dedicated to cover this chapter. So we ended up needing more time to cover chapter 12 than I allotted, which was a failure in planning on my part. So I apologize for that. So we have only 1 day to cover chapter 13. So because of that, I've kind of abridged the slides down a little bit to kind of the bare essentials of what I consider to be essential from the chapter. So there's a fair amount of material in the chapter that I'm not lecturing on, and as is usually the case, I will not include anything that I haven't included in these slides on your final exam, which is the only exam that you guys have left. And there will be 2 quizzes feeding that exam, quiz 4 and quiz 5. And as I mentioned, quiz 4 is due tonight. All right, so when we think about the concept of personality, I think we all have a pretty good understanding of what we're talking about when we say the word personality. When we say personality, we're talking about the way that we expect a person to behave across situations, right? If you know someone well enough, if you've interacted with someone enough, if you have enough behavioral data that your brain has recorded about that person, you have a pretty good sense of what that person is like and how they're going to behave in a given situation, right? And that's what we mean by personality. And the textbook gives a precise definition that you see here: the characteristic thoughts, emotional responses, and behaviors that are relatively stable in an individual over time and across circumstances. So that's pretty straightforward. Interestingly, though, as is the case on a lot of topics that we've explored in this class, psychologists love to argue with each other about what shapes personality, and they love to argue about how to measure it. And there are lots of different ways of slicing up personality and measuring it. And we're going to look at some of the heavy hitters here today. And like I mentioned, we're certainly not going to have time to cover every single topic covered in the chapter. And I'm certainly not even covering every theory of personality that's mentioned in the chapter, but I'm hitting the highlights, and I'm not going to have time to go into the stuff on self-concept and self-esteem. I personally think self-esteem is a little overrated anyway, but just my bias. But the textbook kind of backs me up on that. Okay, so let's talk about some of the major theories of personality. So for those few folks who have just logged in, please don't forget to sign in the chat. And we are talking about personality today. So our first theory of personality that I want to explore a little bit is probably the oldest theory of personality in the book, and a theory of personality that has been very influential in our pop culture lexicon. A lot of us speak Freud and don't even know it, which of course pertains to psychodynamic theory. So Freud had some very clearly defined ideas on what personality is and how it develops and what comprises it. So the foundational notion of Freudian psychology, or psychodynamic theory as it's known, as we've talked about before, is the idea of the subconscious. Freud ultimately believed that most of what shapes us, most of what determines our behavior and our feelings and who we are, ultimately what defines us as human beings, that most of that is stuff that exists below our level of awareness and what Freud referred to as the subconscious. The ultimate Freudian notion is that of the subconscious. With all other of Freud's quacky ideas aside, I think this is the foundational Freudian idea that has to be grappled with. And I think there's actually some merit to this idea that we all have things about ourselves that we don't want to face, things about ourselves that terrify us, that we would rather not think about. The problem with that, though, as many of you might be aware, is that monsters grow in the dark, right? So the idea behind Freudian therapy is to unearth those monsters from the depths of the sea, which is the subconscious of your psyche. And once you expose those monsters to light, you make them lose their power, right? Monsters get smaller when they're exposed to light. So the thinking goes. And Freud believed that the three principal structures of the psyche or self are the id, the ego, and the superego, which I mentioned before. And these are the three structures of the self that are constantly in conflict with each other to have influence over who you are, what you do, and what you feel. So the foundational part of the self that we're all born with, according to Freud, is the id. This is the primal part of the self. This is the part of the self that is consumed with selfishness. It's pure selfishness. It's all about seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, which we've talked about before as the pleasure principle in Freudian thinking. And we're all born as little balls of id, little seething cauldrons, as Freud referred to infants famously. But the problem is, as we've talked about before, that we can't just do whatever we feel like, whenever the hell we feel like doing it. There would be serious social consequences for behaving in such a way. We have to balance the demands of our id with the demands of society and the demands of the world around us. So we develop these other two structures that balance this purely selfish force out. The other, one of them is the superego. And this is the part of the self that's concerned with morality and concerned with the rules of right and wrong. It's the part of the self that makes us feel bad when we contemplate doing something bad, or makes us feel really bad and ashamed when we actually do something that we consider outside of our moral code. So all of our feelings of guilt and shame and self-loathing and all of that comes out of the superego. And according to Freud, this is the internalization of society's morality and standards, right? So whatever religion you're raised in, whatever cultural standards you're brought up with, you internalize those standards of behavior and they become your superego. So for many folks, this has largely a religious sort of flavor to it. And then the other structure of the self is the ego, which is the tip of the iceberg that you see peeking above the water. The ego is the rational part of the self. It's the part of the self that people see, and it's the part of the self that we're most self-aware of. So, but it's the smallest part of the self, according to Freud. And most of the self is below the surface of the water, comprising the id and most of the superego as well, being in the subconscious. So Freud believed that the id is constantly in a power struggle with these with these other, not the id, the ego rather. The ego is in a constant power struggle with the id and the superego, and that really the three of these are constantly in conflict with each other to control our behavior and our feelings and who we are as people. And that if any one of these three structures is overly dominant, it could relate in certain personality tendencies, for example. So if you have someone who's overly dominated by their id, this would be someone who lacks self-control. This might be the sort of person who ends up in jail a lot, the sort of ne'er-do-well, screw-up type person who can't stay out of trouble, right? Because they're just not thinking things through. If you have someone who's overly dominated by their superego, this is the sort of person that might have low self-esteem, a lot of feelings of guilt and shame, a tendency towards depression, perhaps, if overly dominated by the superego. If you have someone who's overly dominated by their ego, you have someone who's kind of narcissistic and self-absorbed and a little too pleased with themselves, right? So a healthy personality, there's sort of a delicate balance that has to be achieved between these three psychic forces. And another thing that Freud believed was that the ego is constantly employing tricks to keep things in our subconscious from rising to our awareness. The ego is wanting us to be able to successfully navigate the world. And there are certain things about ourselves that we might not want to face, things about ourselves that make us uncomfortable. And instead of facing them, we try to keep them buried in the subconscious where they can't make us feel bad, right? The problem is that even though they're in the subconscious, they still have a way of shaping our behavior, according to Freud. But the ego employs these tricks known as defense mechanisms to keep these uncomfortable things buried in the depths, bottled up, so to speak. The problem, of course, is that when you keep things bottled up, there's a pressure that builds up, and this pressure can try to force its way to the surface. And Freud believed that this was the root of a lot of mental illness and mental anguish, was the fact that we bottle these things up in our subconscious that we refuse to face. And we do this through defense mechanisms, these tricks that the ego employs to keep these things bottled up in the self-conscious. So, for example, denial is probably the most well-known defense mechanism on this list, and a lot of these defense mechanisms have made their way into our pop culture lexicon, and we might be speaking Freud and not even be aware of it. But denial is one that you might see a lot in folks who have an addiction of some sort or another, like alcoholics or people who have a substance abuse problem. If you talk to addicts who are still actively in their addiction, one thing that you might commonly hear come out of their mouth is, "I don't got a problem. You're the one with the problem. You're the one that's got a problem. I don't got a problem with my use. You're the one that has a problem with it," right? And there's actually two things that are going on there on this list. There's denial that there's a problem, but what's the other one that just happened? You're the one with the problem. Projection, right? So, instead of saying I'm the one with the problem, you're the one with the problem, right? For pointing out my problem, you're the one with the problem. So you might say that that's an example of projection, which is attributing some unacceptable quality that you have to someone else, right? And that's a well-known one as well. And denial and projection are really common in substance abuse addiction. Another one that's common is rationalization among addicts. So, well, if you had a life as stressful as I have, you'd shoot up heroin too, right? If your life was as stressful as mine, you would drink a 12-pack of beer every night too, right? Or 2 bottles of wine. That's what we call rationalization, creating a seemingly logical reason or excuse for a behavior that might otherwise be shameful or harmful, right? So addicts are really good with, they're really talented at denial, projection, and rationalization in particular. And if we have anyone that's in recovery in the class, maybe you can relate to this. But the first step of the 12 steps which was originally developed by Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step of the 12 steps is actually to admit that you have a problem. And it's to, I think that it's admit that you are powerless over alcohol and that your life has become unmanageable, right? And a lot of folks don't like that word powerless, right? And that turns a lot of people off from the program. But ultimately, what is being admitted there is that, yes, I've got a problem here and I can't deny it anymore, right? So we see a lot of defense mechanisms in addiction. Here's another example of a true story, by the way, I'm not making this up, of a friend of mine who, he's a really successful local architect, makes a lot of money. Actually, he probably makes more money in a month than I make in a year, and more power to him because he's really good at what he does. Just a super talented guy, designs homes. And he's gay, right? And for many, many years, because of the fact that he was raised in this ultra-conservative Christian family, he was really afraid to come out. And he was afraid that his parents would disown him, and he was, as they say, in the closet, right? But while he was still in the closet, he often would behave in ways that were really over the top masculine, right? Driving the big pickup truck, and going to the gym all the time and getting super ripped, right? And having a girlfriend that was really attractive, and always winning every game, right? And trying to be this alpha dog all the time, right? Just over the top kind of masculine behavior when he's actually gay, right? Which, I shouldn't confuse gender with sexual orientation. Those are different things like we talked about. But he was really trying way too hard to look not gay, right? Is basically what I'm trying to say. And it was just over the top, machismo, right? And a lot of that has gone away since he's come out. But, he was just afraid of people finding out that he was gay, and particularly his family. He was afraid that they would disown him. I'm happy to report that they didn't. They're not particularly happy about the fact that he's gay, but they didn't disown him like he was afraid they were going to. And he's been out now for a few years, and he's much happier now. But you see that defense mechanism of reaction formation, of trying to seem like the opposite of what you really are. The Shakespearean phrase that comes to mind is "the man doth protest too much," right? Porcelain commented, "We were talking about this in my criminal justice class. My teacher said that just admitting to your problem, whether it be alcohol or something else, means you're already halfway there to solving your problem." Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that, right? Because so much of the problems that we have in life, whether it be an addiction or something else, is just not even being willing to face it, right? So I think there's some value to this Freudian idea that most of us have things about ourselves that we're not wanting to face, and we would be better off if we quit bullshitting ourselves through these defense mechanisms and we actually face those things that we need to face. So that's one part of Freudian thinking that I think is right on. And I would say that's the biggest part of Freud's ideas that I agree with, is that idea that we all have things that we're hiding from about ourselves, and we would do well to face those things rather than to keep hiding from them. And to me, that's the most powerful part of Freud's whole way of thinking. And to me, that's the part of his thinking that has the most value. But where I start to part ways with Freud, and I'm sure many of you might as well, is Freud's model of psychological development, particularly what's known as his psychosexual stages. So Freud believed that psychological development and the development of personality, in large part, proceeds through what he called stages of psychosexual development. And he was very hung up with sex, and unusually hung up with sex. And this is one of the strange things about Freud. A lot of people don't understand why he was so he's almost obsessed with sex, right? It seems to a lot of people. I think we got to cut him a little bit of slack on this because you have to bear in mind the culture that he lived and worked in. He lived and worked in Victorian era Vienna. This was Victorian Europe, and Vienna had very much internalized the culture of Victorian Europe, which was extremely prudish. And he particularly worked with a lot of rich housewives, right? So these were women who lived in a society where women wore corsets and chastity belts. And women had to have a male chaperone just to go to the doctor, right? So this was a very sexually repressed society, and people were terrified of their sexuality, and it was just very frigid, sort of prudish culture. So a lot of his clients were these housewives from these rich, well-to-do families who would present in psychotherapy with all sorts of sexual hangups, right? And their husbands would send them to Freud because their husbands would have the complaint that they were frigid, which was an old term for never wanting to have sex. I don't know if anyone's heard that term before, but these women would be frigid, or they would have nightmares about sex. I mean, they were just terrified of their own sexuality, right? And Queen Victoria around the time was famous for saying that as unpleasant as having sex is, a wife should go ahead and do it with her husband because it's her duty to her country to reproduce, right? So that's how people looked at sexuality in Victorian Europe. And it's not surprising that a lot of women had a lot of sexual hangups. So the vast majority of his clients were these rich housewives who had these really hardcore hangups about their sexuality. And I think this might have led Freud to falsely conclude that all our problems were caused by repressed sexuality, right? He was kind of biased by that experience. So I think we got to cut him a little slack for that. But he was overly concerned with sexuality, no doubt about it. Jonathan says, have there been any academic studies that have been raised in a regressive sexual society that makes you more sexual in later life? I'm not sure about that. You mean like a Victorian sort of society, and a person would be like an nymphomaniac basically later in life from being sexually repressed? Because that's what Freud often believed. Yeah, Freud believed that. He believed that that being sexually repressed could actually cause you to develop an obsession with sex, which, yeah, so I think Freud would probably very much be in line with that sort of thinking. So Freud believed that psychological development progressed through these stages of psychosexual development that you've seen displayed here for a few minutes. And these different stages of development were centered on different areas of the body. So as an infant, we're in the oral stage because it's all about sucking, right? Once we get into the toddler period, we're into the anal stage because Freud said that we're learning how to use the toilet during this stage. So he called it the anal stage. And then in middle childhood, 3 to 6 years, we are entering the phallic stage where we discover our genitalia and that it's fun to play with. And then we enter the latency period, as he called it, where our sexuality kind of becomes dormant, and girls have cooties and, like in Little Rascals, where the boys only want to play with boys and they're the He-Man Woman Haters Club, right? And the girls just want to play with little girls, and we kind of forget about our sexuality during this latency period, according to Freud, from late childhood to puberty. And then once adolescence begins with the onset of puberty, the hormones flood in and we become interested in adult sexual relationships, and that's the genital stage. So you can see very much that there's a sexual theme running through all of this, right? And Freud believed that if some sort of trauma happened at a particular stage, it could cause a fixation, right? So Freud believed in what are called fixations. So for example, if some trauma happens to you during the oral stage, like you're not properly breastfed, for example, or you're neglected, then you might develop an oral fixation, according to Freud, which might manifest as a smoking habit, or maybe a fixation, an obsession with breasts, or maybe a gum chewing habit, but something orally based, right? Famously, Freud was once called out by a reporter for his cigar habit, and someone asked him, "Oh, Dr. Freud, do you have an oral fixation?" Right? Because he was a chain smoker of cigars that killed him. He died of mouth cancer from his cigar habit. And his response was, "Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar." It's one of his most famous quotes. But he believed that we could develop these oral fixations. Or if some trauma happens during potty training, during the anal stage, we might develop an anal fixation, which could manifest as what he called an anal retentive personality, which is if you say that someone's anal, you mean that they're overly controlling, they're a control freak, right? So Freud believed that traumas at these different stages resulted in these different personality patterns. There's not a lot of evidence for these psycho stages of development. And Freud famously believed, for example, during the phallic stage, that little boys become sexually attracted to their mothers, and that you go through what's called an Oedipal complex, where you have to resolve this attraction to your mother. And he believed that ultimately the way that it gets resolved is through identifying with your father and assuming the male gender role, and your sexual desire for your mother gets shoved into your subconscious, and then later in life you marry someone who reminds you of your mother, right? According to Freudian thinking. There's just not a lot of empirical evidence that backs up Freud's psychosexual stages. So again, I would say, to me at least, the part of Freud's thinking that has the most merit to it is this idea that we have things about ourselves that we don't want to face. And we employ all sorts of little tricks to BS ourselves into not facing those things. But it's not good for us when we do that. And we would all be psychologically healthier and stronger people if we faced those things about ourselves that we're refusing to face. To me, that's the most useful part of Freud's thinking. So let's go ahead and move on to humanistic theory. Do you guys have any thoughts or comments about Freud at this point? Okay. So the humanistic psychologists, like we've mentioned before, they kind of didn't like Freud because they thought he was overly negative and pessimistic. As I've talked about, Freud had sort of a dark view of human nature. He believed that we're ultimately animals under the veneer of civilization. And Freud just didn't think very highly of human nature, ultimately. The humanists take sort of a different tack on this. The humanistic psychologists, like I've talked about in the past, they were more about emphasizing the positive side of human nature. And the two most well-known humanistic psychologists were Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. We talked about Maslow in the chapter on motivation with regards to the hierarchy of needs, which was Maslow's theory of motivation. The other major humanistic psychologist was Carl Rogers, and he was more interested in psychotherapy, and we'll talk about his ideas of psychotherapy in chapter 15, but he was also interested in self-concept and self-esteem. And a lot of the stuff that you hear about on self-concept and self-esteem is based on humanistic thinking. They tend to put a lot of weight into this idea of self-esteem. But Carl Rogers' most famous book was a book called On Being a Person. And in that book, he talks about this idea of conditions of worth. So conditions of worth are the stipulations that other people put on us that we are expected to fulfill in order to be valued by other people. And they're introduced early in life by our parents. Our parents have certain expectations of us. And according to Rogers, many parents are guilty of loving their children conditionally, meaning that if those conditions of worth are not met, then love and affection are withheld from the child, according to Rogers. And according to Rogers, this is a mistake that we want to try to avoid. And he was big on the idea of unconditional positive regard, which is basically like the idea of unconditional love. That in order for us to develop a healthy sense of self-concept and self-esteem as children, that we need to feel this sense of unconditional positive regard and unconditional love from our parents. And the idea of unconditional positive regard comes up again later in the chapter on psychotherapy. Carl Rogers was a clinical psychologist, and he was big on this idea that psychotherapy clients need to feel unconditionally accepted by their therapists. And this is easier said than done. It's really easy on paper to say, yeah, regard your clients with unconditional positive regard. But folks can share some dark stuff in psychotherapy. And in the brief time that I volunteered at Lakeview, I heard some really disturbing things come out of some clients' mouths. And I might have already talked about this earlier in the semester. I can't remember. But I remember one time at Lakeview when I volunteered, I had a counseling client who divulged that he was having some sexual fantasies of a pedophilic nature, right? It's really difficult not to judge a pedophile. It's really difficult not to show disgust when someone talks about that kind of stuff to you, right? When they open up with that kind of stuff, it's really difficult to seem like you're regarding that person with unconditional positive regard. A lot more difficult than you might imagine, right? So unconditional positive regard is easier said than done, but according to Carl Rogers, it's one of the foundational principles of psychotherapy. And we'll come back to that in chapter 15. So that's about all I want to say about humanistic approaches. Basically, the humanistic approach focuses on the development of self-concept and how conditions of worth shape us early in childhood. The next theory of personality that I want to talk about briefly is under the umbrella of theories known as social cognitive theories of personality. And the two major social cognitive theories, the two major social cognitive theories of personality that are talked about in the chapter are Rotter's expectancy theory and Bandura's reciprocal determinism. Both theories have a lot in common. There's a lot of overlap between the two. I'm not going to talk about Bandura's reciprocal determinism because of time, but there's a lot of similarities between the two. So what the social cognitive theories have in common is they have sort of a behaviorist flavor to them. And there's this focus on the role that our social relationships play to some degree. But the biggest focus in social cognitive theory is the role that our thinking plays in shaping us. So Rotter's expectancy theory looks at personality in a sort of behaviorist way. So personality, according to Rotter and the other social cognitive theorists like Bandura, is that personality is simply an amalgam of our behaviors, right? So personality is just behavior. It's the way that we tend to behave. So personality is just a shorthand term for the way that a person tends to behave. So it's sort of a behavioral definition of personality. And the way that we behave, according to expectancy theory, is shaped by our expectations for reinforcement, the values that we ascribe to reinforcers, and the type of locus of control that we have. So I want to break those three things down a little bit here. So expectations for reinforcement. I talk a lot about weight loss. I use this as an example in a lot of my lectures because it's something that's been an issue for me. I'm one of those folks whose weight has yo-yoed up and down my entire adult life. I'm kind of thinner right now than I have been in the past because I've been pretty good about exercise and nutrition. But I've been pretty overweight at various points in my adult life, and even as a kid, I was sort of a chubby kid at various points. So struggle with with weight and weight loss is an example that I like to use a lot because it's personally relevant. So I apologize if I overuse it, but I'm going to use it again for this example. So let's say that you're overweight or obese and you'd like to get into better shape, right? What is going to determine whether or not that will actually happen for you, right? Is this going to be a wish that's just going to remain a wish? Or is this something that's actually going to be fulfilled in your life? Well, Rotter would say that we want to look at, first, do you expect your efforts to pay off, right? In other words, what are your expectancies or your expectation? What is your expectation that your efforts are going to pay off? Do you expect that if you actually try to get on a weight loss program of changing the way you eat and exercising more often and sticking to it, do you expect that to actually work, right? Well, whether or not you expect that to work is probably going to be based on your prior successes and failures, right? Now, I am someone who has been able to successfully lose weight a number of times in my life. Now, the issue has been just keeping it off, right? But I know how to lose weight. I'm pretty good at doing it, right? So I expect my efforts to pay off because I've done it a few times, and you know, I know how to do it, right? So for me, yes, I expect that if I do put this effort in and change the way that I eat and change my activity levels, that yes, my weight will change and I will get into better shape. Because I know it from past experience. I know what I need to do, right? And I know that it works if I actually get my ass off the couch and do it, right? So that is a high expectation for reinforcement. I expect my efforts to be reinforced. So I can check yes on that question. But the next question is, how highly do you value that outcome? How important is it to you really, right? Is this just something you like to talk about and BS about? Oh yeah, you know, I'd like to get into better shape, but how important is it to you really? What's more important to you? That bag of Lay's and that TV show, or getting healthier, getting more fit, right? How important is it actually to you? Well, for me, it's actually pretty damn important, right? Because my mother died of a heart attack at the age of 48. My mother was on the heavier side when she died. And, you know, heart disease and strokes run in my family, and so does diabetes. I'm pretty, you know, I'm pretty invested in trying to stay healthy, right? And it's important to me that I try to maintain a healthy weight and stay active, in not just for my appearance, but for my health, because I know that these health problems that are influenced by weight run in my family. And I know that if I don't stay on top of it, my life expectancy will be drastically reduced. I mean, my mother died at 48, right? So, you know, I don't want that to happen to me. It's pretty important to me. So I ascribe a high value to that outcome, right? So because of the fact that I expect my efforts to pay off and I value that outcome, according to Rotter, I'm going to be much more likely to actually see that outcome happen if I'm in that situation. Now, like I said, right now, I've been kind of in a better place with my weight, although I could probably still get even more fit than I am. But so whether or not you meet a goal is dependent on whether or not you expect your efforts to pay off and how highly you value that goal. The final concept in Rotter's model is locus of control. So your locus of control really is how much power do you ultimately believe that you have over your life, right? So if you're the type of person who believes that nothing ever works out for you, no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try, it's just out of your control, right? You know, nothing ever works out for me. I've been dealt a crappy hand in life. You know, my genetics are to be overweight, right? I live with someone who, maybe the person lives with someone who brings a lot of junk food into the house. You know, you don't have time to go to the gym. There are all these things outside of your control that just keep conspiring to keep you fat, right? Well, that's the sort of talk that you would hear from someone who has an external locus of control. This is a person, according to Rotter, who believes that the external world controls what happens in your life, right? Uh, Basically, to put it in other terms, this is a person who's not taking personal responsibility for their life. On the other hand, the type of person who takes personal responsibility for their life, which I aspire to, by the way, and this is why sometimes I feel a little bit of an internal conflict sometimes between the social psychology approach and my own way of looking at the world, is I value personal responsibility to the nth degree. And social psychologists tend to kind of downplay it a little bit. And of course, there's probably a balanced way of looking at things. But I'm the sort of person who tends to really say that ultimately you got to take responsibility for your life. You know, what happens to you, you've got to take the reins. And, you know, blaming the world around you and, you know, blaming the hand that you're dealt ultimately is not going to accomplish anything. Sure, some people are dealt crappier hands than others, but what are you going to do with that hand, right? So I can really relate to this model. But those who believe that what happens to them is under their control, those are folks who have an internal locus of control. And according to Rotter, these are the sorts of people who are going to be most likely to meet their goals in life and to see success in life. So I'm kind of fond of this model because, again, I'm a big fan of personal responsibility. Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit about the 5-factor model of personality. This is probably the most influential model of personality these days. There seems to be the most scientific evidence behind it. And when you hear psychologists talk about personality theory these days, this is the model that you're most likely to hear psychologists today reference. So the Big Five model, or the 5-factor model, says that there are 5 personality traits that every human being in the world varies on. And that these are personality traits that are to some degree at least influenced by genetics, by predisposition. And there's evidence, by the way, that that's true.
Mr. Carter,
yeah.
Can you explain these terms to us individually? Because that's something that the book did not do. And, you know, without knowing what they actually mean, it's pretty much useless.
Yeah, absolutely. Fair enough. So openness to experience. And by the way, to remember these 5 easily, there's an acronym, OCEAN, that you can use. But openness to experience is a personality trait that you see in people who are really interested in having the most diverse experiences possible in life. You know, like the types of folks who really want to try a lot of new things. You know, that, you know, if you're really high in openness to experience, you might be this sort of person who likes to travel a lot, try a lot of exotic foods, maybe even try recreational drugs, maybe even have a lot of sexual adventures with a lot of different partners. You know, just the type of person who says you only live once, right? And, you know, you want to experience it all before you die, right? And interestingly enough, there has been some research that's been done on the Big 5 personality traits that's looked at political affiliation. And there's some evidence that folks who are more towards the liberal end of the spectrum tend to be higher in openness to experience. And I don't know if that applies to libertarians as well, but people who are more conservative, people who tend to be on the more conservative end of the political spectrum, on average, there are always exceptions to this, but there's some research to suggest that conservatives might have a tendency to be lower in openness to experience, which again, like I said, is this desire to seek out as many experiences as possible in life, to try as many things as possible, and to have as many adventures and experiences as one could possibly have. Conscientiousness is this attention to detail, perfectionism, folks who set a really high standard for themselves. If you're the type of person who sees a B as a bad grade and you're not happy unless you have an A, then you're probably higher in conscientiousness. If you like to be on time to class or to meetings, if you like to cross all your T's and dot all your I's and do everything the right way, right? And you just set a really high standard for yourself in terms of performance, then you have a high degree of conscientiousness. And there's some evidence that that conservatism, political conservatism, this is controversial. The evidence is mixed, but there's some evidence to suggest that high conscientiousness is positively correlated with being more politically conservative. But again, there are folks who argue about that. Extroversion is the degree to which a person seeks out social stimulation on a regular basis. So if you're highly extroverted, then you're the type of person who seeks out a lot of social stimulation. You're probably having a rough time with being quarantined, right? Because you like to have a lot of time around people. You know, your idea of a fun Friday night would be to go to a cookout or a party or something like that. Whereas someone who's lower on extroversion, who we would call more introverted, this would be a person whose idea of a fun Friday night would probably be something more like reading a good book. And I actually, the middle of that spectrum, by the way, is what's called being an ambivert, right? So sometimes I'm in a more extroverted mood, but I think I have a slightly greater tendency towards introversion myself, which is interesting because I do public speaking for a living, but I actually love reading. Like I'm always trying to find time to read books and go on walks by myself. And, I think I have a slightly introverted streak myself. But the more extroverted you are, the more social stimulation you seek out in life. Agreeableness is the degree to which someone avoids conflict and seeks to warm over conflicts and be a peacekeeper, right? So someone who's very high in agreeableness is someone who is particularly averse to conflict. These are the folks who try to smooth over the arguments between their friends, rather than, they don't like disagreeing with people, right? And they seek out, peace and social relationships and have a tendency to avoid arguments. And people who are lower in agreeableness are people who are more comfortable with conflict, with voicing disagreement, with dissent, so to speak. And neuroticism is a personality trait that pertains to one's degree of emotionality. How emotionally reactive are you? So if you have nerves of steel and it takes a lot to rattle your cage, then you would be considered low in neuroticism. However, if you're anxiety prone or if you're prone to maudlin displays of emotion, then you would be much higher in neuroticism. And all of these have a light and a dark side. So for example, openness to experience, the bright side of that, of course, is you could live a fuller life. You could have a lot more interesting experiences in life. The dark side to that, though, is if you're very open to experience, you might have a higher tendency to try things out that might not be good for you, right? Like recreational drugs or unprotected sex or, other sorts of impulsive, irresponsible behaviors that can get you into trouble, right? So there are extremes. If you're too low in openness to experience, you could be a very boring person who doesn't live your life to the fullest, right? So there's a light side and a dark side to each of these. Conscientiousness. Again, people who are very high in conscientiousness tend to be very successful because they set a very high standard for themselves. But you could also be prone to a type A personality where, a type A personality, you might say, is someone who is very high in conscientiousness and very low in agreeableness, right? So those two, that's the combination that's pretty much the perfect storm of a type A personality. So you're perfectionistic and you're prone to conflict with others, right? That's the basic idea behind the type A personality. But if you're really perfectionistic, this could cause you a lot of grief and, never being able to relax and take it easy, right? So that could be the dark side of that. Having too much extroversion, you might put too much energy into your social life and neglect your inner life, right? Or maybe hanging out with your friends when you should be studying, right? So that could be the dark side of that. Agreeableness. Obviously, the light side of that is agreeable people keep the peace, right? And we need agreeable people to smooth things over and to help keep conflicts in the world from happening. The dark side to agreeableness is if you're too agreeable, you might not speak up for yourself when you need to, when you need to stick up for yourself. You might let people take advantage of you, or you might not speak up when you see something you disagree with happening because you're afraid of conflict, right? So that could be the dark side of that. Neuroticism, folks who are high in neuroticism tend to be very empathic, right? And tend to be, good folks that can relate to you emotionally and, could make a good friend because they're emotionally sensitive. On the other hand, if you're too emotionally sensitive, you could be unbearable to be around because you're so emotionally reactive that, you just become hysterical all the time at the slightest little thing, right? So there's a light side and a dark side to each of these traits, and they exist on a continuum. So it's not like you're either, openness to experience or not. It's, all of them are on a continuum. It's not like you're agreeable or not agreeable. It's, it's on a sliding continuum for each trait. So there's some evidence that these traits are biologically based to some degree. Of course, our experiences shape them, but there's a fair degree of research that suggests there's a biological influence here. For example, identical twins and twin studies tend to have similar big five personality patterns, which is one line of evidence that seems to support that there's a biological dimension to this. And there's also some evidence that these traits are cross-culturally universal, meaning that these traits seem to manifest in all cultures in some way, shape, or fashion. So again, if you want to remember the traits more easily, there's the acronym OCEAN. And in this slide here, we have some definitions, kind of like I've already talked about, but we see some definitions in these slides that might be worth looking over again when you're studying. Okay, so I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the measurement of personality. There are two major classes of personality tests. You have projective tests and you have self-report surveys. And the projective measures are more old school. They're still used by some folks, although they're not as commonly used as they used to be. But the idea behind projective tests, it's kind of based on the Freudian idea of projection that we talked about earlier, that you project yourself onto the world around you. It's one of the Freudian defense mechanisms. So the assumption behind projective personality tests is that if you're shown an image, an ambiguous image, that you will project aspects of your psyche and your personality onto the image. The most well-known of the projective tests are the Rorschach inkblot tests, and also to some degree the thematic apperception test. So these are projective measures, and some folks still use them to this day. Like I said, although these days you're more likely to be given a personality questionnaire than to be given a projective test. But I thought it would be fun. I've never done it, but I thought it would be fun to get my personality assessed using the Rorschach one day, and I've kind of wanted to find someone who could do it. There's not as many folks who are trained to use these tests as there used to be. That's the problem. But with projective measures, the idea is that you show the client or patient a series of ambiguous images, and the client says the first thing that comes to their mind, right? So here on figure A, you see a Rorschach inkblot. And you say the first thing that comes to your mind when you see the image. For me, it's a bat. Now I've probably biased you guys. But there are different things that you could possibly see there. I see a bat. And the therapist is trained to look at your responses to lots of these images. And the idea is that you project aspects of your personality into the images so that your responses to the images give the test giver an idea of what's going on in your subconscious and in your psyche in the way that you respond to the items. The other well-known projective test is the thematic apperception test, which you see on the bottom in figure B. And the thematic apperception test, you are shown a series of images of people in ambiguous situations. And you are asked to create a story out of what's going on in the image, right? So in one of those images, we see a man and a woman, right? And when I look at that image, what I see is there is a woman holding a man back from getting into a fight. That's what I see in that image. Maybe some of you guys see a couple having an argument, right? And she's trying to resolve the argument by being affectionate to him. Or maybe you see a woman gossiping to a man, right? There are different stories that you could come up with that image. So you're shown a series of these kinds of images, and you're asked to tell a story. You create a fictional story based upon the image that you see. And the stories that you come up with will I'm having trouble hearing. I don't know why Siri keeps activating while I'm talking. But in any case, the stories that you come up with will clue the giver of the test in to various aspects of your psyche. And again, these are considered a more old school approach to personality assessment. These days, and this is our last slide from the chapter, these days, if you get your personality assessed, you're more likely to have it assessed using some sort of questionnaire, which is a self-report measure. Some of the more well-known ones are the NEO, and I forgot exactly what the, I think it might stand for neuroticism, extroversion, openness, I'm not sure. But don't quote me on that. But the NEO is the major test that is designed to measure the big five, to see where you stand on the big five personality characteristics that we talked about. Another well-known personality test is the Myers-Briggs. Maybe some of you guys have taken it before. It is a personality test that's based on psychodynamic theory, and I've taken it a few times. The problem with the Myers-Briggs is sometimes you get inconsistent results on that particular test. The MMPI is a beast. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. I think it contains about 650 items that you have to respond to. And it gives you a picture of your personality, but not just that. It is kind of designed to assess psychopathology, which is the presence of mental illness. And I actually used to give the MMPI to inmates at the Escambia County Jail. I briefly had a job working for a forensic psychologist who did assessments of folks who are on trial, who are trying to form some sort of mental health defense. So their defense lawyer would hire this forensic psychologist to do a psychological assessment. And I worked for this forensic psychologist. So I would go to the jail and give personality tests to inmates who were awaiting trial. And I gave the MMPI once to a guy who had attempted to murder his wife. But thankfully for his wife, he was a very sorry shot, right? So he missed, but he was awaiting trial for attempted murder. He walked in on his wife with another man, and he attempted to shoot her dead, but he missed. And so she survived, and he was awaiting trial for attempted murder. And he was trying to form an insanity defense that basically he was blinded by rage and he lost control of his behavior. And he was trying to claim temporary insanity, right? Because he was so blinded by rage from walking in on his wife with another man that he didn't have any control over himself. And I don't think his insanity defense actually panned out. And I think he actually did end up going to prison, but I did administer the MMPI to that guy in prison. So that was an interesting job. And I did a lot of MMPI assessments there at the Escambia County Jail when I was a graduate student. All right, so those are some of the highlights from chapter 13. I finished a little bit ahead of schedule. I kind of expected to take another 10 minutes. We still have about 10 minutes until the class period is supposed to officially be over, but that's all I have for you guys from chapter 13. If anybody has any comments, if anybody wants to discuss, we can do that before we close. Otherwise, please be sure that you have signed in for the day if you have not already done that. And I am working on putting the slides together for chapters 14 and 15, which are our chapters on mental illness and mental health treatment. So we're getting on the home stretch here. And normally around this time of the semester, course evaluations would be sent out to students to do course evals on the instructor. But because of the coronavirus outbreak, the college decided to not do course evaluations at the end of this semester. So if you guys do want to say something about my performance as an instructor, you know, there's still ratemyprofessor.com. You're welcome to go on Rate My Professor and rate me in whatever way you see as being appropriate. But in terms of course evaluations, there will not be the formal course evaluation sent out this semester, unfortunately. I usually look forward to receiving that feedback, actually, so I'm kind of bummed about that. But in any case, if you still want to evaluate me, you can go on Rate My Professor. So we're getting on the home stretch here, and we just have chapters 14 and 15 left to cover. Again, please do not forget that you have a quiz due tonight, and you guys have your third essay due in 1 week. And I will see you guys on Tuesday. That will be it for today. Live long and prosper.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.